I'm Bill Callery. I'll be moderating the webinar. I'm Manager of Programs and Knowledge Exchange at the Chronic Disease Prevention Alliance of Canada, or CDPAC. CDPAC is an alliance of Canada's major national health organizations who share a common vision for an integrated system of research, surveillance, policies, and programs for the promotion of healthy living and the prevention of chronic diseases. To learn more about CDPAC, you can check out our website, and I encourage you to connect with us on our Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube channels, which we've listed at the bottom of the slide. Today's webinar is part of an ongoing series of webinars being co-hosted by the Public Health Agency of Canada's Centre for Chronic Disease Prevention and CDPAC, and is entitled Designing Healthy Built Environments. At CDPAC, we recognize that for many Canadians, the choice to be active isn't always easy, and much of it comes down to the built environments in Canadian communities, which can either enable or discourage physically active lifestyles. So it's really great to be continuing CDPAC's ongoing webinar series with the agency on this topic. Today's webinar is going to begin with a brief description of how the Public Health Agency of Canada is contributing, alongside with other important partners, to addressing the built environment through its multi-sectoral partnerships to promote healthy living and prevent chronic diseases program. Our presenters will highlight a recently funded intervention that's aiming to improve healthy living outcomes of residents in urban settings by transforming elements of the built environment. Finally, our keynote speaker, Professor Colin Ellard, will discuss the psychology of urban and architectural design, describing some of the methods he's using to measure how pedestrians respond both emotionally and physiologically to different urban environments. So again, thanks everyone for joining in. All right, so at this point, I'm really pleased to introduce our presenters. I'm actually going to introduce our first presenter, Dawn Shepard, and I'll leave it to Dawn to be introducing our other presenters. So Dawn has worked at the Public Health Agency of Canada since 2008, and before joining federal government, Dawn spent many years working in community-based public health sector. Currently, Dawn's working in the Partnerships and Strategies Division at the agency, where she's leading efforts to convene multi-sectoral partnerships with organizations engaged in the built environment work to advance healthy living. So thanks for your attention, everyone. I'll now pass it over to you, Dawn.
Thanks, Bill, and hello, everyone, and welcome on behalf of the Public Health Agency of Canada. We're really pleased and excited to have Professor Colin Ellard joining us today from his Urban Realities Lab at the University of Waterloo. I think as many people know, Professor Ellard is a cognitive neuroscientist who brings together the world of experimental psychology and urban design. His research uses a whole wide range of tools to explore how different urban settings can influence our mental state and our health. And I should say also that Colin has written 2 books for general audiences on topics related to his research. The most recent is titled Places of the Heart, the Psychogeography of Everyday Life. But before we turn things over to Colin, I'd like to say just a few words about one of the Public Health Agency's federal funding programs called Multi-sectoral Partnerships to promote healthy living and prevent chronic disease. Because it is through this funding program that we've begun to scope out new partnerships and to fund new initiatives that are aimed at creating healthy built environments. So the Multi-sectoral Partnership Program is designed to support interventions that address common chronic disease risk factors, such as physical inactivity or unhealthy eating, for a funding period of up to 5 years. Funding interventions either test innovative ideas or take proven approaches to scale. And a key element of the program is engaging partners from multiple and diverse sectors. And this includes civil society organizations, the private sector, different levels of government, and organizations working both in and outside of the traditional health field. And the underlying idea here is really that this kind of diversity of organizations and partnerships can help us to optimize reach, expertise, and creativity in tackling these very complex health challenges. While the multi-sectoral program has a strong interest in funding initiatives that have the potential to achieve measurable behavior change at the individual level, more recently we've begun to scope out projects that are looking to make changes in the built environment. And this is with the recognition that we need to be paying attention to the conditions and environments that support health, the ways in which our buildings, streets, neighborhoods, proximity to green space can either encourage or act as a barrier to people's ability to engage in healthy living. Right now, we have a number of built environment projects that are in various stages of development. Some are pilots designed to test how fairly small scale, sometimes quite simple changes within an environment can shift people's behavior. So, for example, naturalizing or animating an open urban space like a small park or even a parking lot to better understand how these kinds of modifications can impact how people use and move and interact within the space. Other projects are piggybacking on larger initiatives that are either planned or are already underway in order to leverage these opportunities. So, for example, working to add healthy design features in and around a housing project that's under development. If you'd like to find out more about the Multi-sectoral Partnership Program, please do take a look at our website, and I think the link is posted on this slide. And in terms of our built environment focus, if you have questions, if you have a potential built environment big idea or even small idea, please do get in touch. We're very open to speaking with you, and in fact, we really welcome these kinds of exploratory, preliminary conversations about potential interventions. And in the meantime, I think the best way for you to get a sense of the kinds of built environment initiatives that we're supporting is to hear it straight from the field. So to give you just a very quick snapshot of one of our built environment interventions, I'm really pleased to introduce Erica Arnott, the Manager of Strategic Initiatives at Elgin St. Thomas Public Health, to say a few words about the Creating Connections project, our very first built environment funded intervention. Erica has been working with local municipalities in the area of built environment and healthy public policy since 2006, and in her time at Elgin St. Thomas Public Health, she's championed the creation of the Cycling Master Plan, which was adopted in 2014 and is now being implemented very rapidly across the region of Elgin St. Thomas. And with that, I'll pass things over to Erica.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to share a bit about our Creating Connections project. Creating Connections is a partnership between 3 local developers, the City of St. Thomas, and ourselves at Elgin St. Thomas Public Health. Our fabulous developer partners are Doug Terry Homes, Hayho Homes, and a development branch of Hayho called Springwater Developments. Before I speak about our project, I wanted to provide a little context about our community. This project is focused in one of our municipalities, the City of St. Thomas. The city has a population of approximately 37,000 people and is located just south of London. We're situated within Elgin County. London, Ontario. Our Creating Connections project received funding the summer of 2015. We are currently in year 2 of a 5-year multi-sectoral grant from the Public Health Agency of Canada, and over the course of the 5 years, we will receive just shy of $1 million from the agency. That $1 million will be matched through both in-kind as well as cash contributions from our 3 developer partners. Our project has the following objectives, which are listed on the slide. As I go through each of these objectives, I will highlight in a few more details about where we're at and how things are progressing. Through this project, we aim to increase rates of walking. Our funding through Public Health Agency of Canada has allowed us to hire an outside evaluator and conduct both pre- and post-phone surveys, as well as collecting a wealth of other baseline data. This evaluator will be working with us throughout the life of the grant. The project also aims to engage the community in a discussion about walkability, community design, and connectivity. Through the project, there will be regular opportunities to engage residents in a conversation about walking through phone surveys, social media, community forums, public meetings, walking audits, and community events. We have also committed to assessing the walkability of the entire City of St. Thomas. This is one piece that we've actually just wrapped up. The assessment identified sidewalk, trail, pedestrian crossings, as well as pedestrian realm improvements throughout the community. I will provide a bit more detail about this on a future slide. Our last two objectives were to make improvements to walkability in a demonstration area. Since the Public Health Agency of Canada funding cannot be used for infrastructure, we identified a demonstration neighbourhood. The demonstration neighbourhood is approximately half of our city. This is an area where developers are preparing to connect new subdivisions. The developers have committed to using their funds to create the infrastructure improvements that are required in this area. The new infrastructure being planned will include key missing connections between a local college and secondary school and two existing neighbourhoods. We will also see a multi-use trail that wraps from one side of the city to another. The trail will start at the west end of St. Thomas near the downtown and will connect from downtown all the way to the south end of the city, connecting several schools, large parks, and it will run all the way to the far east part of the town or city. In total, it will be over 12 kilometers of trail. Our final objective of the study is to study the effects of neighbourhood improvements in relation to rates of walking over the life of the project. I've spoken about our objectives, and next I'll speak and cover the outcomes. At the time of writing the grant, these bullets on the slide were the things that we had hoped to achieve over the span of the grant. I thought I would take this opportunity to highlight the successes we have experienced in our first year and a half of the project. Before I do that, I would like to note that the successes our community is experiencing with respect to walking improvements cannot be noted as a causal relationship to this grant. We have amazing partners in our community, partners including city staff, city council, citizen groups, developers, and other community groups, and collectively we are all contributing to improving the health and walkability of our community. One of the outcomes that we had hoped to achieve was to start a conversation about walking and engage residents in a discussion about the importance of walkability and the improvements that we can make. We also wanted to ensure that walking improvements were based on resident input. So community outreach and engagement will be ongoing throughout the project. However, we are pleased to say that in our first year and a half of the project, we have already had opportunity to hear from over 1,000 residents about their walking experience in our community. This information has included things like how often they walk, where they walk, some of the challenges they're experiencing when walking in our community. From there, we took all of that data from the public, along with information from that was available from our partners, and worked with a consulting firm to assess the walkability of the city. This has included looking at sidewalks, trails, pedestrian crossings, pedestrian realm amenities that will make walking more enjoyable. Once we had all of that data, we actually then developed an evidence-informed prioritization tool, and this scored all of the gaps and improvements relative to things like pedestrian demand, vulnerable populations, road type, etc. City staff will be using these tools in this year's budget process and have adopted this for their use going forward. From the outset of our project, we were aware of the research that shows people are often underestimate how long it takes to drive somewhere and overestimate how long it takes to bike or walk there. Our community is quite small. It is just over 5 kilometers by 5 kilometers, and we think that it's an ideal size for people to walk or bike to all destinations. So one of the deliverables that we are currently working on is a wayfinding signage initiative to promote walking. The signs will be the signs will be installed this spring and will feature the time it takes to walk from key destinations around the city. In addition, we had planned improvements to existing policies on walking as one of our other projected outcomes. Just this fall, the city adopted a Complete Streets Toolkit and policy and is now moving forward with all city infrastructure projects will include plans for walking, biking, utilities, and vehicles. This is an absolutely key and exciting move that our city staff and council should be commended for. Finally, through this project, we of course committed to increasing the number of trails and sidewalks in St. Thomas. We have only had one construction season since receiving our funding, and we are just wrapping up the walkability assessment, which needed to be complete prior to making many of the improvements. However, we are already seeing new trails and sidewalks being installed in key locations where there were obvious missing gaps. Doug Terry Holmes has recently installed a culvert and walking trail that connects the neighborhood to a school, and this year the city has also added 12 new sidewalks and 4 new pedestrian crossings. Collaboratively, we have many excellent partners that are all contributing to improving health and walkability of our community.
Thanks so much, Erica, and thanks for leaving your contact info. So for our attendees, please feel free to get in touch with Erica. So as Dawn mentioned, I'm really have the privilege to introduce Colin again, who's a cognitive neuroscientist and director of the Urban Realities Laboratory at the University of Waterloo. Don, since you've done such a nice introduction, I will, and in the interest of brevity, I will pass it right over to Dr. Ellard.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, everyone, for the opportunity to talk to the group today about the work that we're doing in the Urban Realities Lab. And thank you, Erica, for that fantastic description of your initiative. I was listening avidly, not only because it sounds like a great project, but also because my wife's hometown is St. Thomas, and I'll be going home today and telling her all about the great work that you're doing in the town where her mom still lives. So onward we go. So what I thought I would do is to give you, first of all, a very kind of broad background to the kinds of things that we're interested in my lab. As you heard, I'm an experimental psychologist, a neuroscientist by training, and I tend to, when I can, take kind of a biological approach to what it means to be a human being living in a city. And to do that, one of the things that I like to do is to think about the kinds of conditions for which our minds, our brains are actually adapted, the kinds of settings for which we've evolved. And so if you look at the slide that I'm showing now, it's obviously just a simple diagram, but what it's showing is kind of a generic form of a Neolithic village. So think of how a very small settlement might have been, say, 10 or even 20,000 years ago. And what you're looking at is a plan view. You can't see very much. You can see that there are various circles that have particular meanings to the group. You can see some individuals essentially sitting around a circle where they would have spent essentially all of their time in the out of doors within full view of a small group of people where they knew everybody in the group. So that all by itself is kind of interesting to reflect on compared to the modern condition when you think about things like trust and privacy and what they mean to us and how those kinds of concepts would have been different for a group living in this fashion and the implications that that would have had for the ways that they survived and got along with one another. If you think now about our modern condition where in cities throughout the world, including many Canadian cities, we are living in very high densities, there is an obvious contrast between the kinds of conditions for which we have essentially been built through evolution and the kinds of settings in which we now live. And so the first thing that you might think about is, why the transition from these very small groups of kin and friends to these massive, large cities. And it's not hard to think of, everybody can think of reasons why living in a large settlement is good. They all sort of boil down to the same kind of reasoning, I think, and that has to do with strength in numbers. Large numbers of people can, in many ways, accomplish things that small numbers of people just can't. And so the slide that I'm showing here, I actually showed this slide last week to a group of and got into a little bit of trouble for making the broad general claim that as the size of a city increases, everybody's wages go up, because that's something that may be true at certain times and in certain places, but it may not be generally true. But nevertheless, there's a sense in which it is accurate to say that in lots of ways, life gets better for us in larger groups of people. But in other ways, life becomes more difficult. It becomes psychologically taxing. And so one of the ways that I think about what that means is by looking at research in fields related to mine, but not the same as mine. For example, the field of primatology. So I'm showing you here a scene of a lovely group of monkeys, and I want to tell you a little bit about the work of a primatologist named Robin Dunbar. Robin Dunbar was really interested in the effect of social grouping in different kinds of species of non-human primates. So what he did was to study closely how individuals in troops of monkeys spent their time. And what he discovered was that there was sort of a tax. There was a sort of a tax on the monkeys that related to group size, in the sense that the larger the group of monkeys, the more time they spent actually paying attention to one another, which in a non-human primate often amounts to behaviors like allo-grooming, where they look after one another's coats. The really interesting step in Dunbar's work was that he started to ask questions about the implications for group size and the requirement for monkeys in a large group to be able to pay attention and keep track of one another, essentially to get to know one another, the implications for those kinds of things on the organization of the brain. And what Dunbar discovered was that there was this relationship, as you can see on this slide, between the average social group size, which you see on the vertical axis on the left, and what's labeled here is the size of neocortex relative to the rest of the brain. So essentially, how big the outer mantle of the brain, where we think all of the fancy thinking stuff happens, among other things, is relative to the rest of the brain. And he discovered this fairly convincing relationship between those two things, suggesting that the larger your group size, the larger your brain has to be. And he made the further argument that the reason for that is because of this tax, that it's cognitively imposing to keep track of who's doing what to whom, and essentially in a large group. The final point is, if you look at the graph, you'll see that there's a horizontal dotted line for humans. And so what Dunbar did there was to start with the human brain and the relative size of the human neocortex relative to the rest of the brain, and extrapolate from that about what we could think about what the average social group size of human beings ought to be. And that's a number that's now widely known as Dunbar's number, and it falls somewhere between 100 and 150. The precise number, I think, that Dunbar worked out was 118, for whatever that's worth. It's hard to be really precise about a number like that. But it's a small number. It's, again, if you think about the kinds of conditions in which we now live in very large groups in cities, and compare that with Dunbar's number of around 100 to 150, there's obviously a big mismatch between these two numbers. And so what I'm suggesting in a kind of a roundabout biological way is something that many people have noted in different ways. Jane Jacobs, for example, talked about how the fundamental condition of the city is that we live among strangers. And I think you can go back to these basic kinds of numbers that come from primatology and social group size and say that's it. That's what defines a city psychologically, is this essential precondition where we are living among large numbers of people that we don't know. And that's you can think of that almost as the dark side, I think, of living in a city. What we need to do is to find ways to psychologically accommodate to the mismatch between how we live and how our brains are designed to work. And there's evidence that that mismatch has some implications for brain function. What I'm showing here is a slide from, this is not my own work, this is the work of a group led by somebody named Lederbogen. This was a very well-cited study. It got lots of media attention. What Lederbogen's group essentially did was to carry out an fMRI experiment, functional magnetic resonance imaging, where they put people into the magnet and they exerted social stresses. And the way that they did that, psychologists are really good at making people feel not good. And the way, in this case, that they managed that was to tell their participants that they were going to be doing a mental arithmetic task. And they contrived a situation where there was an apparent glitch in that the researchers in the room could hear the participants could hear the things that the researchers in the room were saying about them, and it was set up to seem as though that was an accident. So the hapless participant would be in the magnet furiously trying to multiply two-digit numbers, and what they would hear on a speaker would be comments like, wow, I can't believe that they got this one wrong. Everyone else got this one right. So far, this person has gotten every single question wrong. And so the idea was to set up a situation where the participant felt stress, social stress. And the comparison groups here were groups of people, as you can see from the bar graphs on the right side of the slide, who came either from cities, large cities, from smaller towns, or from rural settings. And the brain scans that you see on the left are lighting up an area of the brain called the amygdala. And the main finding from this study was that there was a differential sensitivity in terms of the amount of activation in the amygdala, depending on where the participant had come from. Participants who had grown up and lived in cities were much more reactive in terms of the activity of the amygdala than participants who had grown up in rural settings. So what this is suggesting is this is one way in which the brains of people who live in cities might differ from the brains of people who live in smaller settings. And it might reflect those kinds of pressures that I was describing that result from the mismatch between what our brains are designed to do and the kinds of things that we ask of them living in modern cities. So one of the ways that I think about my own work is where I focus on the relationship between, or the psychology of urban design, I guess you'd call it, is that good urban design, its function is actually to serve as, I think of it as kind of a psychological prosthesis. Its purpose is to, when it works well, is to buffer us from the exigencies of living in environmental conditions for which biologically we're not well adapted. So in one way or another, that's how I think of all of the experiments we do, where we try to examine as closely as we can the relationships between the forms of cities, the designs of cities, their layout, and other features, as you'll see as I get into my own work, and that element of psychological sustainability and that buffering between how we live and what we're built to do. So here's a snapshot of my happy group and a link for our lab website, which I confess is slightly dated at this point. We need to update it. But if you're interested in finding out at least who the people are who are involved in the work that I do, you can see some of them here in this slide, and you can follow the link for yourselves. So now, beginning with the work that we do, I mentioned that I was a psychologist. If I had to narrow that down in the context of the work that we're doing now, I would call myself an environmental psychologist, which means that I'm mostly interested in how the settings of our lives influence who we are and what we do. And environmental psychology is an interesting subdiscipline of psychology. It arose really in the 1960s, the 1970s, with a series of traditional approaches, many of which involved doing quite simple experiments, many of them in laboratories, where we basically asked people to look at pictures of scenes and to make responses to those scenes. The work that we do, somebody called the work that we do brass band environmental psychology, and I wasn't sure exactly what he meant, but I kind of liked the name, so I use it. But the idea is that we're interested in using a somewhat more novel set of tools to understand the relationships between settings and psychology, and especially urban settings. We do look at those kinds of relationships in interiors, architectural interiors as well. And I'll say a little bit about that towards the end of my talk, but mostly I'll focus on urban scale experiments. So one of the things that we're really interested in is the influence of natural landscapes on people's behavior and even on their physiology and on their health. And this is an area of research in environmental psychology that actually has quite a long history, beginning with some landmark studies carried out by somebody named Roger Ulrich, who did a study in which he compared the recovery of men undergoing gallbladder surgery and recovering from gallbladder surgery in a hospital in the United States. And he made a simple comparison of between men who recovered in rooms that had a view of nature from their window with rooms that didn't. And he discovered that there was a marked difference in both the time to discharge and other variables like the levels of analgesics that were administered to the two groups. Men with views of nature seemed to be at least reporting and perhaps experiencing less pain post-surgically than the other group. And that single finding caused essentially an avalanche of research into the effects of natural environments on human psychology and human physiology, with now lots of evidence suggesting that there's this, it seems, near magical relationship between presenting people with even simple views of nature, photographs. We've used virtual reality in some of our experiments to do nature exposure, or, of course, the real thing, taking walks in the woods, visiting parks, and the organization of the mind, our ability to pay attention to things like measurements of cardiac variables, blood pressure, stress levels, either measured through self-assessment or through other means. And so I thought I'd show you, again, this is not my study. This is a study by a psychologist named Mark Berman, who is at the University of Chicago, but you might recognize the map that I'm showing you here as a map of Toronto. And what Berman did was to carry out a very careful survey of the amount of tree coverage in different neighborhoods in Toronto, and that's what you're looking at here. And then to conduct some studies of public health variables, asking questions in these neighborhoods that ranged from questions about the incidence of things like metabolic disease and cardiac disease, but also asking people about their self-assessments of their own health, because it turns out that asking people how well they feel is not a bad way to find out how they actually feel. And what Berman discovered was that even when you co-factor out the influence of demographics, so things like, for example, people's income, which you would expect also to vary by neighborhood in a city, there was this link. There was this link between how well people were, their state of health, both self-assessed and objective, and the amount of tree cover that they had in their neighborhood. And Berman actually went so far as to say that you could boil this down, this relationship, into numbers. And the numbers that, one set of numbers that he suggested was that if you take every block of a neighborhood, every city block, and you add 10 boulevard trees, it's as if you reduced the average age of the people who lived on that block by about 7 years. So he was making what I thought was a really compelling argument for the link between all of the variables that we're able to measure in laboratory settings or field settings and the public health implications of this link. Interestingly, Berman also discovered that the effects that he described only really seemed to hold true for trees in the public domain. So people who had lush backyards filled with trees didn't seem to be contributing to the public health impact of green cover in cities. So nature is a really important element of urban life. I always say that, there's a tendency still among some people to think of things like landscape architecture in cities to be kind of an aesthetic nicety, a bauble that maybe we can add to a city once we've got all of the really important things right. And my counter-argument is to show research like the research of Berman suggesting that no, that having green space of every kind in a city is absolutely fundamental to the health, the mental health, and the physical health of the people who live in the city. The work that we're doing in my lab has been more focused on trying to understand what the locus of that effect is. And what I mean by that is that we know, again, from a vast amount of research that there's this basic connection between the experience of nature in cities or anywhere else and its psychological and physiological effects. We'd like to know a little bit more about why there is that linkage, where it comes from, especially at the level of the brain. And we have different motivations for that. Some of them are theoretical. We want to understand this link because I think it's important and interesting. But secondly, also because we feel as though if we understand how natural settings are promoting psychological health and physical health, then maybe there are possibilities for including some of the elements that produce those effects in nature by other means. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. One of the things that we're really interested in, and we're not the only ones, is whether there might be something in the deep mathematical properties of natural environments that might be responsible for what some people call the restorative effect of nature, this near magical effect on how you think, how you pay attention, and ultimately physiological variables. And a lot of people have focused on the idea of there being an underlying fractal nature to scenes of natural environments. And the best way to illustrate that, I think, is with the picture that you're seeing now, which shows some fern fronds. And if you look closely at the fern fronds, you'll notice that they have this interesting property, and that is that there is replication of the shapes that you see at a number of different scales. So what I mean by that is if we focus on one big frond, say the big frond that's kind of separate from the others towards the bottom left of the slide, you'll see one shape. And then if you focus on the next level down, you'll see that shape repeated, and so on and so forth at a number of scales. So one of the ideas is that we may actually be exquisitely sensitive to that kind of fractality in scenes, and that somehow that does good things for our brains and ultimately for our bodies as well. We've taken a little bit of a different approach for a number of reasons, the biggest one being that, so far as we know, there's never been any evidence for anything like a fractal detector in brains. But we do know that brains are filled with, the visual system is filled with detectors for a different property of visual images. And to illustrate what that is, I'm showing now a slide which what you'll see here hopefully is a series of vertical stripes, but you'll notice that the stripes are more visible in certain parts of the frame than they are in other parts of the frame. And what's being done here is if you look from left to right on the slide, you'll notice that the stripes get closer together. And if you look from the bottom to the top of the slide, you'll notice that the contrast between the dark and light parts of the stripes decreases. So this slide is basically showing you all of the combinations of stripe thickness that we call spatial frequency, and contrast that are visible to the human eye. So you'll probably see some kind of curved shape that surrounds the area where you can see the stripes from the area where you can't see the stripes. And so what this slide is actually doing is showing you all the combinations of spatial frequency and contrast that are visible. What's interesting to us about that is that we know that the visual pathway is divided up into a number of discrete areas, and each of those areas has a particular set of preferences for what combinations of spatial frequency and contrast it can see. And we've been conducting experiments where we've been using images like the ones that you see now on the screen, where we use filters to present participants only with selected subsets of all of the spatial frequencies that we can normally see. So if you look at the blobby image on the left, that's showing low spatial frequencies, so the big wide stripes. And if you look at the image on the right, you're seeing high spatial frequencies, so that's the finer stripes. And if you look closely, you can probably figure out that both of the images that we're showing here are the same scene, and in fact, it's an urban scene. But what we've tried to do, this is work that has been done with one of my former grad students, Delcho Volchanov. What we tried to do is to see if we can figure out which spatial frequencies are the key ones in terms of driving that preference that we have for views of nature. So we've been doing experiments showing images like the ones that you see on the screen, asking people to indicate their preference for one image or another, degrading the images in many cases to the point where you can't actually tell what they are images of, but still asking people to indicate their preference. And the next slide shows an outcome from one of our experiments. And so the way to read this, it's the doublets of bars. Each pair of bars is meant to represent a comparison of a natural and an urban environment. So when you see the natural environment bar being higher than the urban environment bar, then that means that people had a preference for the natural images as opposed to the urban images. So on the far left, you can see the pair of bars labeled unaltered at the bottom. So it's not surprising there that when we just show people straightforward images, they show a preference for natural environments over urban environments, as essentially everyone else who's done an experiment like this has also shown. But where things get interesting is where we show that that preference is only driven by the appearance of a certain set of spatial frequencies in the images. So only some filtered images show a difference between people's preferences for natural and urban images and not others. The reason that interests us is because if you can pinpoint the critical spatial frequencies, then you can look at how brains are organized for processing this information, and you can make some educated guesses about where the locus of our preference for natural scenes might reside. And what I'm showing now on this slide, so it's not a great slide, it's a little bit blurry, the imaging figure shows the ventral, the bottom view of a brain. And the areas that you see highlighted, that's an area of the brain called the parahippocampal gyrus. And that's an area that we know from other work is interested in or responds to layouts, responds to scenes rather than individual objects. And it's also an area that seems to be especially interested in the spatial frequencies that are present in that drive the restorative effect according to our studies with pictures. The other thing that's interesting about this area, if you look on the right, it's meant to show the presence of opiate receptors. This part of cortex contains an abundance of opiate receptors. So think of receptors that drive naturally reinforcing kinds of behaviors, everything from food to sex. Think of things like runner's high. Those kinds of natural reinforcers often involve naturally occurring opiates and opiate receptors in your body. So it's beginning to look to us as though that we have this system built into our brains that's designed to provide the same kind of strongly reinforcing effects when we are immersed in nature or even looking at views of nature as some of these other kinds of natural reinforcers. It's as if biologically we're built to be drawn to these kinds of scenes, which might also begin to account for why in many contexts we found them to be so health-giving. So I mentioned that one of our motivations is to see whether this kind of work can tell us anything about how we should do urban design, other than the obvious fact, which is that it's really important to include good landscape architecture in any city. And it would be a really important project, and we're working on this a little bit as well, to figure out what the dose-response curve is like for these kinds of effects. So in other words, how much nature should there be? How often should there be exposure to natural settings? And how comprehensive do those natural settings need to be? Does a park bench under a tree do it? Mark Berman's work would suggest maybe yeah. The simple answer is that we don't have an answer to those kinds of questions yet, and yet they're quite critical to answer. The image that I'm showing you now it has a little bit of nature, as you can see towards the bottom of the slide, but it's mostly not natural. But it's nevertheless one of the most reinforcing images that we've ever used. And we think that it's because the same kinds of mathematical structures that are present in scenes of nature are also present in this image. So this is obviously an older architectural style that you can find in many cities, but it's at least encouraging with respect to the idea that there may be ways that we can build, even when we're not planting trees and bushes, that might actually be psychologically restorative. The bleeding edge, I guess, of this kind of thinking is some work that we've just started doing with an architectural studio in Toronto affiliated with the University of Waterloo. This still comes from the studio work of an architect named Philip Beasley. And the creation that you're looking at here is something that he called Hylozoic soil. And you can probably see that, first of all, it's clearly an artificial structure. You can see some people walking through it, which gives you some sense of its size. What you can't tell from the still is that this is actually a responsive environment. So as people walk through this sculpture, the sculpture is actually responding to them. There are sensors that know that you're there. There are actuators that actually cause the sculpture to move as you explore it. And one of the things that we're interested in, not necessarily because we're suggesting that one might want to build structures like this in cities, but maybe we do, is that it might give us some clues as to exactly how we can invoke some of the same kinds of effects as produced by natural environments in settings, for example, where it might be difficult for one reason or another to include a park space. So that the settings that we've used so far for this kind of work have all been interiors, but we've begun to talk about maybe an outdoor installation using the same kinds of principles. And it brings to mind all kinds of almost science fiction-esque possibilities. One of the things that we've been talking about is the possibility that you can maybe go beyond a structure that simply is biomimetic, as these ones are, and maybe think about the possibility of developing something like an empathic relationship between a person and their setting. So the structure not only responds to you, but in a sense comes to care for you and you for it. I know that people are talking about these kinds of ideas in more pragmatic kinds of environments, but for us at this point it's kind of I guess you'd call it an intellectual playground to think about how to develop these kinds of ideas, ultimately to apply in real settings. So I want to move on now. I see that my time is rushing by quickly, but I think I can get through everything that I want to say. We'll see. I want to move on now to talk about something else, and that is the effect of the skins of buildings, building facades on our behavior, on our psychology, and again on our physiology. And I'll talk a bit about some of the methods that we've used to study those relationships, beginning with something really simple. This was a simple field observational project that we did in the city of Toronto. Some of you who live in Toronto might recognize this fence. This is as you can see, it's a fairly forbidding-looking construction fence. It's on Lansdowne Avenue in Toronto. It surrounds a construction site that's been laying empty for several years now for complicated reasons. And the city, in its wisdom, thought we can't just leave a chain-link fence with barbed wire at the top in the middle of the city. It's like a city block for years and years. We have to do something. And so they had a public art competition. And the nice, simple black plywood, laser-cut plywood appliques that you see on the fence were part of the winning entry for the public art competition. So I've got a few different images of this. Here's one. Here's another one that shows some built structure. Here's one that shows some birds. When I first visited the site, I thought, nice, birds. A nice touch. And I didn't realize at the time that this was kind of a bow to some local culture. There are a couple of neighbors in this neighborhood who sort of compete with one another to draw pigeons to their property. And so there are these two houses that are just filled with pigeons and also, sadly, the product of pigeons. It's a little bit of a mess, but it was kind of a neighborhood joke, not in a nasty way, but just kind of part of the culture that the people who lived there knew about, and outsiders, unless they were told, as I was, would not necessarily have got. I think that's okay. So we decided to do a simple study where we watched from afar how people behaved just as they walked past that design fence. The image you're seeing now is our control fence. This was a fence, I believe, at Bathurst and King Street in Toronto. It actually looks different now, but at the time of our study, this is what it looked like. You can see, again, it's a chain link fence, not much going on behind it. And what we did was to plant an observer on the street, both at the design fence and this fence, to just watch the goings-on. She acted as though she was waiting for a bus that apparently didn't come for days. And she recorded simple elements of behavior, and she compared the control and the design fence. So I'll just show you the results quickly. One of the things that she looked at was just the number of times that people turned their head. And she separated turns towards the fence from turns towards the road. And you can see happily here, if you compare the control and the design conditions, that in the design site, people did seem to be paying a little bit more attention to the fence. There are more head turns towards the fence than towards the road. I also had her record the number of times that people paused for whatever reason, whether it was to tie a shoelace, do something with their phone, smooch with their partner, what have you. And again, you can see that there were more pauses at the design site than the control site. But here's the finding that was so dramatic that I was sure initially that we'd done something wrong. What we did was to look at people's walking speeds in front of the two fences. And we measured walking speeds by timing how long it took people to walk from one end of the fence to the midpoint. And we did that, and then from the midpoint to the other end of the fence. And we did that, by the way, in both directions, so we didn't get weird directionality effects. And if you look on first of all, on the left side of the control site, you can see that people walk in front of the control site essentially as we believe that people walk in terms of their speed in most cities around the world, and that is at an average walking speed of about 5 kilometers per hour. But if you look at the design site, what happens is that by the time people are walking on the second half of the fence, their walking speed has dropped from, again, an average of around 5 to a speed of around 2.5 kilometers per hour. And so, as I said, when I first got the numbers from the student who did the study, I thought, oh, she must have done something wrong. So I went back to the site and sat at the bus stop myself and watched for a while. And you can see it. You can see a palpable decrease in walking speed as people move past the site. These are everyday commuters who have seen this site presumably hundreds of times over the course of that time, just walking back and forth to public transportation. So the lesson here, it's a simple one, and we're not the first ones, of course, to say it, but the lesson here is that simple kinds of interventions can have a dramatic effect on what people do. And in this case, we don't really know what's happening inside people's minds and bodies as they walk past this fence, but we know that it's engaging them, and we suspect that some good things are happening to them. So to get inside people's minds in that way, we have conducted what we call our walking experiments. And walking experiments, they're pretty much what they sound like. We get people to walk. We design curated walks with a number of specially selected stopping locations. We take people in groups through city streets. We equip them with smartphones that we program to ask them simple self-assessment questions. I'll give you an example in just a second. And we also, when we can, suit them up with some simple sensors that we can use to measure their physiology. So what you're looking at here is a map of the very first experiment of this kind that we did in New York City, and some very small thumbnails of the stopping points. Here's an image of a typical group in New York City. They're receiving instructions from a facilitator. We tried to be careful to get people to settle, to pay attention to the part of the streetscape that we wanted them to be commenting on. and to be as principled as we could, although with field work it's always a little bit of a gamble. Here's an example of a self-assessment question. We often use, these are called self-assessment mannequins. We often use tools like this to avoid linguistic differences that might occur, especially in multicultural samples. I've listed some caveats of these kinds of measures where we ask people, how do they feel? Do they feel happy? Do they feel sad? Do they feel aroused? Do they feel bored? People are pretty good at accessing inner states, but not all of them, and they're not always accurate. People often will tell you what they think you want to hear, in other words, demand characteristics. And sometimes people don't understand exactly what it is that you're asking for. So for all of those reasons, as I said, we try to use sensors when we can for one thing or another. The kind of sensor that we've used the most is for something called skin conductance or electrodermal activity. Think of old school lie detector tests. In a way, what you're measuring is the state of people's sweat glands. It's not quite as simple as to say that we're measuring sweat, but that's not all that far off. The reason why that's valuable is because that gives us a window into people's levels of physiological arousal during our experiments. Happily, there are all kinds of different tools on the market now for measuring skin conductance in mobile settings, and everything that you see on this slide is stuff that we've used in one way or another in our experiments. But most commonly, the effective AQ sensor, which sadly is no longer available on the market, but it has been replaced by the device that you see in the center, the Empatica, which is great, but unfortunately kind of expensive. And so here's an example of the kind of data that we get from these sensors. This comes from the Empatica. The traces are showing movement. They're showing heart rate in the middle, and they're also, it's not changing very much in this example, but they're also showing electrodermal activity. And you might be able to notice a slight rise in electrodermal activity in this sample. So what we can do with this kind of data is we can mash it up with GPS data to get images like this one, where what you're looking at, again, this is a walk through New York City. The blue contours that you see represent the average physiological arousal as measured using electrodermal activity from a group of walkers in the route that we selected in New York City. And you can see, and so the height of the contour represents the level of arousal. And you can see that it rises and falls. You can see that there are some high contours. The high contours in this case happen to fall along busy streets and intersections, and the low contours fall in areas that are surrounded or actually where people are actually immersed in green space. At the very bottom, you see a community garden where people's physiological arousal went quite low. Here's another example of how you can use this kind of information. What you're looking at here is the same kind of plot. It's a Google Earth plot with contours overlaid. This time these contours come from a single individual walking around in the area of the most notoriously pedestrian unfriendly intersection in the city of Mumbai. And I'll show you on the next slide. I'll give you a better sense of what's actually happening here. So I don't know whether my scrolly arrow is actually visible to you, probably not. But if you look on the right side of the screen especially, you'll notice that there's this kind of big rising curtain of physiological arousal. And that's happening as this, now again, remember this is an N of one, this is one person. That's happening as this one person is walking towards a very wide, uncontrolled intersection that she's going to have to cross to get through traffic. And in Mumbai, even in controlled intersections, that can be a little bit of a vexed proposition to do. And so you can see how you can measure the dynamic unfolding of pedestrian stress in this particular context, and hopefully see how valuable that might be able to be, that might be in kind of assessing the stress points for pedestrians in a city. Here's another way in which we've used these kinds of measures. We've been interested in the relationship between people's self-assessment and physiological variables. So I mentioned that self-assessment tools are not always the most reliable things for getting at people's bodily states. And when I went to do these experiments in Mumbai, you're seeing a group of participants standing in a traffic circle in Mumbai. I was completely freaked out by what it was like to be a pedestrian in the city and how hard it was to actually cross streets in a city where the cars and trucks essentially never really stop. They slow down a bit, and they won't hit you on purpose, of course, but you need to learn the ropes to do what I've always called a kind of a combination of parkour and ballet to get across the street safely. When I asked people who lived in Mumbai what it was like for them to do that, they said, oh, it's no big deal. You just get used to it. And so we did a small experiment where we tried to put that to the test by getting people to self-assess their states of arousal, but also measuring their physiological arousal using the electrodermal response. And this is a comparison of self-assessment and physiological arousal. And there's a lot of stuff on this slide, but what I'd like you to do is to find the bars called traffic and look on the left, first of all, at people's self-assessment of their arousal in the traffic circle, where you'll notice that it's actually the lowest value of all of the sites that we used. And then find on the right that same bar for physiological arousal, where you'll notice that it's actually the highest bar. So there was, for us, this really interesting dissociation between what people said was true of their states of arousal and what we were actually able to measure in their bodies. The lesson being that we're not always necessarily in good tune with the state of our bodies. And when we say that we've gotten used to something, that doesn't necessarily mean that we've come to be fully adapted to it in the sense that it's not harming us anymore. It might just mean that it's still harming us, but we are just accustomed to being harmed, which is not good. Another thing that we've looked at, again now kind of getting back to street facades, we've tried to make comparisons of what we've called open or high complexity facades and low complexity or closed facades. And here's a couple of examples of open facades, the left in New York, the right in Berlin. Here's a couple of examples of closed facades, again, the left in New York, the right in Berlin. That view of the extreme closed low complexity facade in Berlin, believe it or not, is a restaurant. It took me some time to figure out what that was, and I still don't know why it was built that way, but it's a beautiful experimental example of a closed facade. We used those settings to, first of all, measure people's appraisals, their self-assessed affect, or how good they felt in those two settings, and we found a small difference in preference, or self-assessed affect at least, happiness, call it if you like, high complexity being preferred to low complexity. And when we looked at measures of physiological arousal, here's what we found, that people standing in front of those low complexity settings were, first of all, not very pleased, not very happy, not very engaged, but also were showing skin conductance that was actually lower than baseline. What that means is that the values had dropped since even when they were standing in the laboratory getting suited up and waiting to go out on the walk. And in contrast, you can see that the high complexity settings engaged the nervous system as much as they seemed to engage people's emotional states. And so we've argued that what you're seeing here, this combination of kind of lowered affect and lowered physiological arousal, looks very much like the signature of boredom. And boredom as well is something that's really interesting from a public health perspective, because we know from other kinds of studies, that laboratory studies, that boredom is actually associated with things like, for example, increased release of the stress hormone cortisol. There is even some evidence that mortality rates differ between or are correlated with levels of chronic boredom. So the argument here is less that if you stand in front of a boring building for too long, you will drop down dead, but more that over the course of a lifetime of experience, chronic exposure to low complexity facades may actually have a measurable effect on public health. We've done quite a number of these kinds of studies now. I've put a link up on the screen to take you to our website called Psychology on the Street, where you can see at least some of the results of our two most recent experiments, one in Toronto and one in Vancouver. Now, relating this back to sort of high theory and experimental psychology and what does all of this mean, we have often been guided by the ideas of the fellow who you're seeing on the screen, a University of Toronto psychologist now passed away named Daniel Berline, who was really the father of this area of inquiry. And Berline argued, if you look at the inverted U-shaped curve, he argued that there was a sweet spot for complexity, that we don't like things that are low in complexity. We don't like things that are high in complexity. We like things that are sort of in the middle. So find the sweet spot in any kind of material, where be it a street level facade or a piece of art, and you'll find things that people like. So we've been exploring that a little bit, and now we've turned back to the laboratory, and we've been using experiments in virtual reality. And here's a picture of our setup, and on the right, an image from one of our models. This is actually Shibuya Crossing in Japan, as it never looks because you see there's no people there, but just to demonstrate how some of our urban settings might look. For experiments on complexity, this is work done by my grad student Vedran Zabic. He's designed, as you can see here, very contrived artificial streetscapes where people are invited to just walk from the beginning, which would be the foreground in the slide that you're seeing, and just to keep going. And you can see maybe that there's a series of choice points, most prominently, again, in the foreground, but those choices continue as people continue to walk through the virtual environment. And what we've been looking at is how the design of the skins of these settings influence people's choices as to where to go. And what we found so far, this is work that's very much in progress. Vedran is almost done writing and hopefully publishing this stuff soon. But we found that inverted U-shaped relationship that Daniel Berline reported is not the only kind of factor that might influence people's preferences, and that it's important to make a distinction between variables like interest, for example, and pleasure, that when people report on how much pleasure they take from something, it might not be the same as their reports, their self-assessments of interest. And we've been exploring the importance of other kinds of variables in facade design, like symmetry and legibility, for example. And so the idea is to kind of build up, both from the field investigations that we're doing and also from the laboratory investigations using VR, a kind of principled understanding of what actually works in the design of urban facades and what actually might promote psychologically sustainable environments and good mental and physical health. I think that I'll just spend 5 minutes talking about awe, because I really love this research. Another one of my students named Hannah Nagami has been doing some research on awe. So if you look at this image, some of you may remember the first time that if you've seen this image, you may remember the first time that you've seen it. It appeared for the first time to the world around 1968, July 1968, in fact. But most people have seen some version of this image, and it almost universally produces an effect on people that we would describe as psychological awe. And normally psychological awe is defined as a combination of epiphany and immensity. So we have the feeling that we're in the presence of something much greater than ourselves. That's the immensity. And the epiphany is that it changes the way that we think of ourselves. So we've been really interested in trying to understand how awe works in built settings, and we know that it does. The image that you're seeing now is clearly a piece of religious architecture, and religious architecture is certainly by design a setting that induces a state of awe. What Hannah's been trying to do is to see whether she can boil down the actual architectural elements that contribute to feelings of awe by doing experiments where in the first phase of experiments she presents trained raters, observers, with a series of images, and she gets them to break down their architectural elements. So things like whether there are arches, how high the ceiling is, whether there are windows, natural light, furniture, ornamentation, and so on and so forth. And then in the second group of participants to get the same images or another set of images rated in terms of how much awe they produce. And so here's a couple of examples from our picture set. This is the highest awe image in our entire set. This is the pool at the Hearst Castle in California. And here is the lowest awe image in our set. And of course, we've got other images that bracket that range. And Hannah has used a method called exploratory factor analysis, a statistical method, to try to boil down what are the elements in interior settings that contribute to the emotion of awe. And these are the factors that she's identified. You can see listed here as immensity, adornment, and light, and you can see some of the constituents that go into these main factors listed on the slide as well. So what we're trying to do here is to, the first phase of the research is to try to understand how architectural settings, initially interiors, might generate feelings of awe in observers. But the second part of the study involves looking at the effects of the generation of the feeling of awe. You might ask, why would anybody care about what makes awe or otherwise? And the reason that we should care is because feeling awe actually changes our behavior. It's been demonstrated experimentally now a number of times that when people have experienced awe, they become more patient. They become more generous. They are, for example, more willing to donate money to a cause. They're more pro-social. They're more likely to help one another. Not only that, but there's also some tantalizing evidence that, again, there's a relationship between our state of physical and mental health and the experience of awe. There's been some fascinating work looking at the levels of cytokines, inflammatory molecules in the body that in part mediate the harmful inflammatory responses that can be brought on by a whole host of conditions, everything from bad diet to a stressful lifestyle. And the evidence so far, it's early on, and again, this is not our evidence, the evidence early on suggests that there's a relationship between recent experiences of awe and the levels of cytokines in the bloodstream. So again, there's potential for a link between the kinds of settings that we find ourselves in the everyday and variables that are very much related to public health. And I think that's the end of what I had planned to say. If you're interested in following up on any of the ideas, most of what I've talked about is covered in one way or another and more in my book, Places of the Heart. You can also find more information at my website along with the Psychology on the Street website. And there's my Twitter handle as well. And I would be remiss if I didn't also acknowledge the hardworking students and alumni of the Urban Realities Lab, without whom essentially everything that I've said today would have been completely impossible. And likewise, the generous money givers who have helped all of this research to happen. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Ellard. It's been really interesting. Thanks for sharing this, yours and others' really great work on the psychology of urban design and built environment. Hopefully our participants have found that interesting. And we've got about 10 minutes now to take some of the questions from our participants. So I'll jump right in. The first question, let's start with the first question to Erica. It's from Lindsay. She says, I'd like to know a little bit more about how you've articulated and defend health benefits while presenting your project to stakeholders and funding agencies. And do you have any tips for urban planners that she could share through the Canadian Institute of Planners Healthy Communities Committee?
So I would say with the stakeholders, we had built some existing relationships with both our developers and had worked with the city for quite a period of time already. So I don't know that there was a ton of requirement to talk about the health benefits because of the existing relationship that had kind of built over time. I think they understood from the get-go why we were around the table, why we were inviting them. And then through the process of applying for the grant and refining our proposal and all of that, I think it became we've just grown as a group to understand how we can see health benefits and how it really benefits them as well as us to be at the table together. So I don't know that I can specifically answer that in terms of, building the case for other partners.
Yeah, great ideas. There's a comment from Joanna, who, and I think this is to you, Colin, she's just mentioning that in Victoria they had a developer that used a very similar approach to the one you showed in Toronto. And they had a developer using plywood fencing that's really popular with some construction sites, and they had an artist paint the fencing with abstract designs. So I guess this is an approach that's been used elsewhere as well. So, Olympia asked kind of a comment and a question. She mentions that it's been noted that a lot of European professionals, such as architects, are trained about the environmental and health effects of all built materials that are accepted by government. And she says, for instance, what would be the impact of carpet versus hardwood in an interior, or brick and cement versus wood? Engineered wall frames and insulating frames, etc. And do you have any reading or further references to point attendees to about this?
That's a really interesting question. In fact, there is evidence. I'm not sure that I could immediately spring forth with the references for this, but I know that there's certainly experimental evidence that the use of natural materials in interior settings as well as exterior settings can produce effects on people's emotional states and on their behavior as well. So again, generally it's a good idea when it's possible, when it's practical, to use those kinds of materials in construction. But again, as I said, one of the things that interests me is the possibility that when we understand some of the underlying principles, that may to some extent liberate us to think about using other kinds of materials to produce the same kinds of health-giving effects.
So next question from Patrick, again a kind of a comment / question, is he says, wouldn't too much exposure to high complexity tend to equal low complexity? So he's thinking of, for example, Times Square in New York City. There's so much exposition to advertisements and eye-catching complexity, yet the crowds are often just walking by, and we could easily differentiate tourists from daily locals.
Yeah, I think that's true, and to some extent that's what Daniel Berlein was trying to address with this kind of inverted U-shaped function. The idea that, of course, there can be too much of a good thing, and Times Square is a great example of exactly that kind of effect. So I think the state of the story at this point is that, yes, we still think that you can definitely go overboard with complexity, but we also think that there are other kinds of variables that play a role. As I mentioned, things like legibility and symmetry can trump complexity. So it turns out that you can have quite a low complexity facade, but if it has some of these other elements, especially symmetry, it seems, then people might find that approachable and pleasant. But in answer to the main question, I'm certain that you can go overboard with complexity, and that that can be unpleasant. I'm not sure how that would light up in terms of physiological results, though, whether you would expect to see you might expect people to essentially turn inward away from their setting and show low physiological arousal. But we haven't looked at the really high end ourselves in our experiment, so I don't know what would happen for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe more work in this area to start to explore some of those things. Next question is sort of the practical implications of your work. So can you discuss some of the practical implications of your work for policymakers and others working to improve the public realm at the community level, like NGOs and grassroots community groups?
Well, in terms of the work that we've done, I guess the two things that I would say, because the main work that we've done is with facade design and with natural landscape, would be to you can actually measure things like facade complexity. So one possibility would be to think of using the same kinds of hard physical measures of facade complexity that we do to make predictions about what's actually going to work for, again, for psychological sustainability. In terms of natural landscape, a couple of things. I mean, one is that in the absence of really good data that we're working towards but don't have yet about what dose response curves might actually look like, we could maybe have more refined recommendations for how much, how often, and where landscaping could be deployed. The other thing that we're working on is, and this is becoming an increasingly important factor in many cities, is mitigating the negative psychological impact of tall buildings. We're getting some really dense, oppressive settings in now, I think, not even just our biggest cities, but it's creeping to our mid-sized cities as well. And there is just the smallest bit of evidence suggesting that, scientific evidence suggesting that people find those kinds of settings daunting, psychologically oppressive. And that's another area where the strategic deployment of good landscape architecture can have a really surprisingly powerful mitigating effect on that oppressiveness. And so, again, this is something that you can actually, with careful measurement, make predictions about those mitigating effects when you're planning landscape architecture. So from our domain of expertise, which so far is focused on those two areas, facades and natural settings, I think that those are the kinds of recommendations that we would make.
Great. Thanks very much, Dr. Ellard. Well, we're a little bit over time now, so we'll start to wrap up. I just wanted to thank our presenters so much, Dawn Shepherd with the Public Health Agency of Canada, Erica Arnett with Elgin St. Thomas Public Health, and Dr. Colin Ellard from the Urban Realities Laboratory at University of Waterloo. Really appreciate you sharing your work and your projects and your knowledge with us today. Special thanks to some of the behind-the-scenes people involved in putting together the webinar, Heidi Staples and Denise Harper, working vigorously behind the scenes to market and set up this webinar, so thanks. And to the Public Health Agency for continuing to co-host the webinar series with us. Thanks to everyone in the audience for hanging in there and staying a little bit over time as well. And we're so glad you could join us today, and hopefully you'll be able to join future events as well. So thanks, everyone. And finally, I'd say for your wellness, hopefully you can get outside for a walk and get your daily dose of green space exposure. So thanks all, and hope you have a great rest of your day.